There's a strange kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from spending years around people while quietly feeling unseen. Not hated, not abused, not even rejected in any obvious way. Just emotionally unnoticed, like your inner world existed behind glass. And the strange thing is, many people who carry this feeling struggle to explain it. Because nothing dramatic happened. There was no single catastrophe, no cinematic tragedy. Just 1,000 subtle moments that taught them one lesson. Your feelings are less important than keeping everything stable. So you learn to stay easy to manage, easy to ignore, easy to forget. And after enough years, that way of living starts to feel normal. You stop asking for too much, you stop expressing discomfort, you stop expecting emotional support. Eventually, you stop even noticing your own needs. You become functional, reliable, self-sufficient, and deeply disconnected from yourself. I think a lot of people of older generations know exactly what this feels like. Many of us were raised in homes when survival mattered more than emotional expression. Parents were stressed, exhausted, working constantly, trying to endure life rather than understand it. Emotions weren't discussed. They were minimized, buried, swallowed whole like medicine with no water. Some fathers never said, "I love you." Some mothers expressed care through duty rather than affection. Not because they were evil people, often because nobody had ever taught them how emotional safety worked. And children are incredibly adaptive. When a child realizes sadness is inconvenient, they stop showing sadness. When they realize vulnerability creates tension, they become quiet. When they sense that love feels more available when they perform well, they become achievers, caretakers, peacekeepers. The child slowly disappears behind the role they created to survive. And years later, that child becomes an adult who feels guilty for having needs at all, an adult who apologizes too much, who hesitates before texting someone, who feels like a burden for simply existing in another person's emotional space. That feeling can become so deeply wired into someone that they mistake it for personality. I'm just independent. I don't need much. I'm fine. But sometimes I'm fine is just emotional camouflage with good posture. Because people who learned to disappear emotionally often becomes experts at functioning while exhausted. They take care of everyone, support everyone, listen to everyone, carry responsibilities like overloaded grocery bags cutting into their hands. And somewhere along the way, they stop asking who is carrying them. The difficult part is that this pattern is often rewarded. Society praises people who sacrifice themselves quietly, who never complain, who continue producing no matter how empty they feel. You become strong, but strength without self-connection eventually turns into emotional cement, rigid, heavy, cold. And the tragedy is that many people don't realize how harshly they speak to themselves until much later in life. The inner voice becomes automatic. Don't be dramatic. Stop being weak. You should be grateful. Other people have it worse. You are asking for too much. And after enough repetition, the voice no longer sounds cruel. It sounds reasonable. It sounds responsible. It sounds like truth. But it isn't truth. It's conditioning. And that realization changes everything. Because once you understand that your inner critic was built from years of emotional adaptation, something important begins to happen. You stop seeing yourself as broken. You begin seeing yourself as someone who learned survival strategies very early. And survival strategies are not character flaws. They are emotional architecture built under pressure. A child who becomes hyper-independent isn't failing. A child who becomes emotionally numb isn't defective. A child who learns to stay invisible is responding intelligently to their environment. The problem is that survival patterns rarely disappear when the danger disappears. They follow us into adulthood like old software still running silently in the background. And many adults continue living as if emotional safety is still unavailable, even when it no longer is. That's why feeling can feel so strange at first, because healing often requires doing things your nervous system once considered unsafe. Resting, receiving help, expressing needs, being emotionally honest, taking up space without apologizing for it. For some people, that feels almost unnatural. There are people who can work themselves into exhaustion more easily than they can sit still and enjoy a peaceful afternoon. People who can care for an entire family but feel uncomfortable buying themselves something nice. People who instinctively comfort others while privately believing nobody would truly understand them. And underneath all of it is usually the same quiet fear. If people really saw me, would I still be loved? That question sits at the center of more lives than we realize, which is why self-compassion matters so much. And self-compassion is deeply misunderstood. People hear the phrase and imagine weakness, excuses, self-pity. But real self-compassion is none of those things. It's accountability without cruelty. It's learning to speak to yourself like someone worth protecting instead of someone constantly on trial. That doesn't mean pretending your mistakes never happened. It doesn't mean avoiding responsibility. It means understanding that punishment and healing are not the same thing. Some people have spent decades at war with themselves, believing the battle was somehow making them stronger. But endless self-criticism rarely creates growth. Usually it creates exhaustion. A mind constantly under attack cannot become peaceful. And maybe one of the saddest things about emotionally neglected people is how often they extend kindness to everyone except themselves. They forgive others repeatedly. They understand everyone else's pain. They offer patience, empathy, support, yet internally they live beneath a collapsing ceiling of impossible standards. Every mistake becomes evidence. Every failure becomes identity. Every moment of weakness becomes shame. Eventually, the person stops feeling like a human being and starts feeling like a project that never reaches completion. But healing begins the moment you interrupt that pattern. Not dramatically, but quiet. Healing is often almost invisible in the beginning. It looks like noticing the way you speak to yourself. It looks like resting without inventing reasons to deserve it. It looks like enjoying something simple without guilt hanging over it like rain clouds. Sometimes healing is as small as sitting in silence and realizing you no longer want to spend your entire life fighting yourself. That's a powerful moment. Because many people spend years searching for confidence when what they actually need is gentleness. Confidence grows naturally in environments where gentleness exists. A nervous system constantly preparing for criticism cannot fully relax into authenticity. And this is why understanding your past matters. Not to blame your parents forever, not to stay trapped in resentment, not to turn pain into identity, but to understand the origin of your patterns. There's a difference between saying, "my past explains me," and "my past defines me." One creates awareness, the other creates prison walls. You can acknowledge that emotionally unavailable environments shaped you without surrendering your future to them. In fact, understanding your conditioning is often the first moment real freedom becomes possible. Because once you recognize that many of your deepest insecurities were learned, you can begin questioning them. Maybe you were never too much. Maybe your emotions were simply inconvenient for emotionally overwhelmed people. Maybe you were never weak. Maybe you were carrying emotional weight nobody noticed. Maybe your worth were never supposed to be measured by productivity, usefulness, or how little space you occupied. That realization can feel both comforting and heartbreaking at the same time, especially for people who spent most of their lives believing love had to be earned through sacrifice. And sacrifice becomes dangerous when it completely erases the self. Some people spend so long caring for others that they eventually wake up and realize they no longer know who they are outside of service. That realization can feel terrifying, like walking into an abandoned house and hearing your own footsteps echo. But it can also become the beginning of something honest, because eventually there comes a moment when a person asks, what do I actually need? Not what makes others comfortable, not what keeps peace, not what maintains the image. What do I need? For many people that question feels unfamiliar because nobody ever taught them they were allowed to ask it. And this is where community becomes important. Healing rarely happens entirely in isolation. Human beings begin repairing emotionally when they feel safe enough to be real. Sometimes the most healing sentence in the world is simply, I understand. Not advice, not fixing, not analysis, just recognition. Because emotional neglect creates loneliness that survives even in crowded rooms. And being truly seen can feel almost shocking after years of invisibility. That's why honest conversations matter. That's why vulnerable spaces matter. That's why connection matters. Not performative connection, not algorithmic noise disguised as intimacy. Real connection. The kind where people stop pretending long enough to tell the truth. And maybe the most hopeful part of all this is understanding that healing does not expire with age. There's this quiet cultural myth that emotional growth belongs only to the young. But people can begin understanding themselves at 30, at 50, at 60, at 90. The human heart does not suddenly become incapable of change because the calendar moved forward. Some people discover themselves only after the responsibilities quiet down, after caregiving ends, after careers end, after survival mode finally loosens its grip for the first time. And suddenly there's silence. Not empty silence, but revealing silence. The kind that forces a person to finally meet themselves honestly. That can be uncomfortable, because when you spend your life focused outward, turning inward can feel like staring into a mirror you avoided for decades. But it can also become the beginning of peace. Not perfect peace, not permanent peace, just a gentler relationship with yourself. And honestly, that changes more than people realize. Because the longest relationship you will ever have is the one you have with your own mind. Every day, every failure, every quiet evening, every sleepless night, every memory. You live with yourself through all of it. So eventually the question becomes, will your inner voice remain a courtroom, or can it become a home? Maybe not overnight, maybe not easily, but gradually, through small acts, resting, speaking honestly, allowing joy, setting boundaries, accepting support, forgiving yourself for being human. None of these things are dramatic, but neither is healing most of the time. Healing often looks ordinary from the outside. A person taking a walk instead of punishing themselves with work. A person saying no without writing a 12-page apology in their head. A person sitting quietly with their emotions instead of running from them. Small moments, small rebellions. But small things change lives. And if you grew up feeling emotionally unseen, I want you to understand something important. Your value was never determined by how well other people recognized it. People can fail to see beauty without beauty disappearing. People can fail to understand worth without worth vanishing. Sometimes emotionally limited people simply could not give what they never learned themselves. That absence shaped you, but it does not define your final form. You are still allowed to become softer, still allowed to become visible, still allowed to take up space in your own life. And maybe that's where healing truly begins. Not when the past disappears, not when every wound closes perfectly, but when you finally stop treating yourself like someone who must earn the right to exist, and instead begin meeting yourself with the same kindness you spent years giving everyone else. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. See you the next time, and until then, stay free and unique on your journey to your personal true north.